We've been processing 500 to 700 black walnuts per year as a hobby for a couple of years now. This fall, 2013, a friend brought me a pail of butternuts, American butternut, I think. I thought they would process the same as black walnuts, but I didn't realize what the differences were. Here I take a look at some of the differences in the nuts themselves and the differences in the way that we process them. Here are examples of black walnuts on the left and butternuts on the right. Black walnuts, butternuts. Notice that the butternuts are more pointed than the black walnuts. The butternuts are also more round in cross section than are the black walnuts. If you look closely, you can see that the corrugations on the butternuts are deeper than the corrugations on the black walnut. Lastly, again, if you look closely at the butternut, it seems to be divided into 4 segments. Here's kind of a major segment, and then here on this axis is sort of a minor segment. But you can see those 4 segments pretty clearly. Whereas on the walnut, of course, you can see that it's more oblong, but it's really harder to determine a segment like you can see on the butternut. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the husks of the 2 nuts. I'm sorry, but I don't have any good examples of black walnut husks at various stages. I will add some still photos of batches of nuts in various states with husks on them. But this is one of the butternuts out of my pail that I hadn't scratched the husks off of. I had just let these dry until the husk became powdery and just kind of comes off and crumbles like this. And with this one right here, I can just kind of pull the husk off and it separates, and that's kind of the end of it. It's thin, other than the ridges on the inside that match the ridges the ridges or flukes or whatever you call them here. It's very thin. It's a 1/16 to 32nd of an inch thick, and it wasn't all that much thicker when I got them fresh. Thin husks. Whereas the black walnut, the husk is a good 1/4 inch thick or so when they're off the tree, when they've fallen off the tree ripe even. So the husk on this guy is a lot thinner, and I'm almost absolutely positive that it has less of a staining characteristic on the hands than the black walnut does. I've read that they used to make yellow and orange stains, dyes out of the black walnut or the butternut husk, whereas they used to make dark brown and black dyes out of the black walnut husk. And I can believe that. So at any rate, the husk is thin, it comes off easily. Once these were dry, I just threw them down on the gravel out in the driveway and just ran my feet over them like I do when fresh black walnuts need to be dehusked. But this was after they were already dry. And I didn't have to do any of the soaking in the pail and stirring and all that like I did with the black walnuts. Here is an example of another butternut, just for information's sake, with the husk still on it. So you can see it's shiny, and this one is fairly tight fitting, but it does crack off with the fingers, and it's, you can see that, and it's fairly dry and powdery and dusty at this point. And here's yet a third with probably a third butternut with maybe 80% of the husk still on it. Here's a picture of mature black walnuts with husks still intact.
These nuts range from pretty firm green husk nuts through yellow, then yellow-brown, at which point they are starting to get pretty gooey. Some, even farther along, are all brown and a few are almost black, but in all cases they are still about 1/4 of an inch thick.
Now let's take a look at the nuts on the inside. I've bandsawn apart a couple of nuts of each kind. Here are 2 bandsawed black walnuts, and here are 2 bandsawed butternuts. Here it's pretty easy to see that the internal structure is different. Again, black walnuts and butternuts. When I consider cracking the nuts open to get the nut meat out of them, for me, it works best to crack both kinds of nuts in an endways fashion by squashing from the ends rather than from the sides. Okay, from the ends, the end, squish this way rather than from the side. I get a higher percentage of larger pieces of nut meat when I do this cracking from the ends. Some people's results seem to differ, but that's what works best for me. For the black walnut, which shows this major, fatter and minor axis, cracking them on either one of those axes seems to crush the nut meats more than crushing them on end, like that. Between my fingers would be the vice jaws. And similarly for the butternut, where you can see these axes, fissures, or whatever you want to call them, trying to crack them on one set of segments versus the other set of segments, either way yields a poorer percentage of large pieces of nut meat than cracking them on the end. One problem with cracking them on the end is, since they're so pointed, the nuts may want to slide kind of sideways in the vise, or the first crack knocks off this little end here a little bit. So it takes a little more getting used to get them to crack quickly than it does the black walnut. Here we will crack a black walnut by the ends, and the idea is to look at the shape of the nut after the cracking has occurred. You can see that the nut meats are kind of hiding inside there, quite well protected. There is a piece of nut meat that's sticking out there. That's pretty good. And it even comes out of there in pretty good shape. But we definitely do want to show that the nut meat is pretty well hidden in there. Next, we will crack a butternut by the ends, which will be a little tougher to do, but then the idea is to look and see what the broken pieces of shell look like afterwards. Okay, you can see the deep hollow space to the, well, to this side right here. The nut has popped out of there. And again, and half a nut is there in my hand. So this is a real good demonstration of how differently the butternut opens up when I crack it than the walnut does. This is another major part of the same nut, and you can see how it just opened right up and let that half a nut fall out. And again, or yet, here is another piece of that same nut, and that half comes right out too. I'm sorry about the jiggling around here as I attempt to focus, but I'm really trying to show you what the nut looks like close up. And I guess more importantly even, the openness of the structure inside the shell compared to the black walnut. Now I'm going to crack a couple of walnuts on the side to show you the difference in the way the nuts open up. I've backed the camera off a little bit, so I hope this doesn't come out too small. But I'm going to crack it on the skinny side, not the flat side, the wide side, the thin side. And again, I'm not trying to crack to really squeeze the dickens out of it. I'm just trying to squeeze the vise until things pop and, you know, and start to come apart. But here, I hope you can see that I've really mashed things up in there quite a bit. Although I guess I'd have to admit that, you know, I've got some pieces in there that I might be able to get out, but usually when I do it this way, it mashes it up pretty good, the shell. Here's the other half. Let's do another one. This will be a second black walnut, and this one will crush from the wide end. And just one good pop. Whoop, lost a little bit of nut shell. And again, if you look closely, you can see I've crushed a bunch of the nut meat here. It's just kind of crushed up. Let's see if I can get any more work done by crushing that one again, or squishing that one in the vise again. Maybe this time I'll just squash the end to see what happens. Okay, that was an end squish, and I've still got quite a bit. I still have quite a bit of work to do. That was an end squish. Now let's do a side crack on a couple of butternuts. So we talked about the major and minor axis or ridges or whatever you want to call them. So we'll crack one along the major ridge. There, and I just tried to, it popped, but nothing's coming apart, so I've got to put it back in and do it again. And do a little more, I did a little more crushing, popping. and here I broke the nut in half in the middle. So with the butternut again, you know, we had really good luck getting big whole halves out, and here we broke both of them in half already. So now we'll crush one more along what I'll call the minor seam, and I don't know if you can see it all that well, but this is what I would call the major seam right there, and this is what I'd call the minor seam. So we'll break it along that seam instead. Hope I got that right. And it just crunched things up big time. We just have a big mess on our hands when we do it that way. And you'll notice that crushing on the minor seam ends up having these little ripples that are inside the nut that don't hold any nutshell at all, showing up real good. But that doesn't make a very good answer to getting the nut meats out either. If everything works out great, just to kind of recap, if we squash them by the end and everything works out great, it's like the segments almost just fly apart. So just as a recap, we'll just do one more butternut by the end. Oh, that crack was just the sharp end breaking off. There. And so now, if we take a look at this one, there's the whole nut. And let's see if I can just kind of take it apart here. And again, we take it apart, and here's one half that's just about to come out complete. And then in the other half, almost a complete half will come out. You can see this whole half of the nut, the piece that's sticking out of the other half is just gone from that hole there, which seldom happens with a walnut. Here we're going to crack a walnut on the end seam. This is a bad nut. This would have been a floater. Out of 50 or 60 nuts that I've handled today during the making of this video so far, I've only had 2 nuts that were either empty or had really shriveled up meats inside. So we'll try another one. Cracking it on the end, by the ends. Whoa, that one went all over the place. But here we come about as close as we're ever going to come to getting a half a nut meat. This will just take a tiny little bit of work with the side cutters to get a half a nut meat out of. And another big chunk of nut here has got a couple of big pieces that'll come out of it. Now we'll crack a black walnut on the wide, across the wide side this way. And it just kind of makes a mess of the nut. It just squashes things, breaks things in half and so on. So that's why I do not like to crack the nuts from the side. Here I have just freshly cracked about 20 butternuts in the vise, and without any use of the side cutters to break the nuts apart to get the nut meat out, I just took a couple of minutes and sorted out all the major pieces of nut meat, well, most of them, that were just already laying there as a result of the vise work. And so if you take a look here, these are the that's the amount of nut meats that came out of these 20 nuts so far without going any further. Here are a couple of examples of what a whole half of a butternut nut meat looks like. Here's my finger for reference. Looks like a little paddle, doesn't it? Here we're looking at a couple of butternut shells right after cracking them endways in the vise. Notice how the deep empty cavities are very visible, and complete halves of nut meats came out of those shells. Notice that there's a lot of shell area here that doesn't have any nut meat in it. I think with black walnuts that's not quite the case, but having this thicker casing with a thinner nut, if you will, makes it a lot easier when I go to using the side cutters to clip open the nut to free the rest of the nut meat. Like that. Okay, there's a lot more room, airspace if you will, distance from the nut meat itself, to make it easier to split the shell open and get the complete nut meat out. This again much easier than with a black walnut. For those of you who are interested in such things, here is the nut meat yield from about 20 butternuts. There's a finger for reference. Okay, let's weigh the nut meats and the shells just to get an idea of what percentage of the material is nut meat. So here I've got my little number 2 soup can on the scale, and I guess it's telling me the tare weight on that is about 1 3/4 ounces. Okay, we put those nuts in the can, put the can on the scale, and now we have 2 3/4 ounces. So it looks like we got about 1 ounce of nuts out of this much shell material. So now let's weigh the shell material. We'll put the shell material into this coffee can, and we see that the tare weight is 7 ounces on the can. Okay, we'll place the can on the scale, the can full of the shells, and we now have 14 ounces. The shells, the coffee can weighed 7 ounces. We saw 14 ounces with the shells in there, so the net weight of the shells is 7 ounces. So the weight of the unshelled nuts would have been 8 ounces. So that's the 8 ounces. So just roughly the nut meats are 1/8, or about 12.5%. Edible. Now we're talking about black walnuts. Here I have just cracked 20 black walnuts in the vise in the same manner that I cracked 20 butternuts recently. Let's look and see how much nut meat I was able to get out of that these shells without having to do any breaking of the shells apart. So this is all we got. There are no complete halves of walnut there at all, and only a few pieces that are fairly good size, but a few. But that's all we got. So if you compare that with the amount of nut meats that come freely out of the butternuts, you can see that the black walnuts are a lot harder to extract the nut meats from. Now I'll go ahead and extract the rest of the nut meats. I have just cracked 20 black walnuts in a vise, and I just showed the amount of nut meats that I was able to separate from those freshly cracked walnuts without having to do any digging or cutting up with the wire cutters, side cutters. And now I have extracted all the nut meats that I can out of the 20 nuts, and this is the pile that I got. So now we will weigh nut meats in the shells and determine the percentage by weight of edible material out of the 20 nuts. First we'll weigh the soup can, and we see that it weighs about 1 3/4 ounce. Next we will weigh the soup can with the full production from the 20 black walnuts. And we have 3 and 3.4 ounces, let's call it. We will first weigh the coffee can, and we see that it weighs 7 ounces. Now we've added the shells from the 20 black walnuts, and we'll weigh that gross amount, and it turns out it weighs 16 3/4 ounces. 16.7 ounces we'll call it. Okay, after we do that weighing and we add things up here, we get 14.9% edible versus the butternuts at about 12.5% edible. They're pretty close, huh? That isn't a big difference. Maybe about 10% difference, more material out of the black walnuts than we did out of the butternuts, but it isn't a great big amount. And for 20 nuts, the net weight of the shells of the butternuts was 7 ounces, and for 20 nuts, the weight of the shells in the black walnuts was 9.7. Well, that is fairly heavy, heavier. We know that the butternut wood is a lighter colored wood and a weaker wood. I have never weighed any to see whether the wood itself is lighter than walnuts, but if it is, it might be appropriate to think that the nuts would be relatively lighter too. Anyway, there's the story of the difference or similarity between black walnuts from a nut meat standpoint. You can see that there's quite a difference in the shape and in the shape of the nut meats between the butternut and the black walnut. Black walnut trees are still doing well in America, but the American butternut has been dying off rapidly for the last 30 years or so. I hope you get a chance to sample both kinds of nuts for yourself.